This is immigration and citizenship attorney Parviz Malakouti Fitzgerald. Today is June 16th, and welcome everybody to our eighth spaces discussion, mobility spaces. And we got Patrick here, we got Jay. Today we're going to talk about the US passport card in the Apple Wallet. This is new news coming up about apparently new capability of the Apple Wallet to use the US passport card for limited purposes. So as always, this is an open discussion. Anybody is welcome to speak. Just send me a request and I'll approve it right away. And I've linked a few articles into this spaces, basically. One is a New York Post article, another is Travel and Leisure, and the other is a link to the TSA website, specifically the page regarding acceptable identification at the TSA checkpoint. So what's going on here? So I'll just read a quick excerpt from the New York Post article. It says, so the title is TSA approves real ID alternative for iPhone users, but only for certain types of travel. The article says your passport's going digital, but don't go tossing the hard copy just yet. Apple just unveiled a buzzy new feature that'll let iPhone users upload their passport into Apple Wallet this fall, turning their device into a one-stop shop for jet setting, at least within US borders. And I think that's a key distinction. We'll talk about that. The new digital passport will be accepted at TSA checkpoints, making those airport security lines just a little less painful. And then finally, there's a quote from an Apple spokesperson. While not a replacement for your physical passport, digital ID can be used for domestic travel and at supported TSA checkpoints, an Apple spokesman said during the company's latest splashy event, as reported by USA Today. So this is obviously a new feature. Obviously, it seems to me that there's going to be an added level of convenience, right? It's typically more convenient when you're able to access some sort of document in more ways than one. But I think the big question is, certainly the first question that came to my mind, probably the minds of others as well, is what do you give up in privacy and security in order to basically have this feature and to use this feature? So, obviously, the way things stand right now, when you're traveling domestically in the United States, you show up at you show up at a checkpoint for TSA. You give forth one of your IDs, a real ID or a real ID substitute, and then you pass through TSA to get to the gate to go traveling. Now, one thing and one other aspect that I think is very little known, and we'll talk about this, is the fact that you actually have a chance to pass through TSA even without real ID, even without any ID, actually. I think a lot of people don't know about this, but you can present yourself at a TSA checkpoint. You're not guaranteed to be allowed to pass, but if you have totally non-compliant ID or even no ID, you can go through a process of giving additional information about yourself to allow TSA to have a chance to verify your identity. So this is, I think, the big issue, the $1 million question. What are people going to be giving up in privacy, security, and specifically vulnerability to future hacks by giving access to Apple about their travelability? And are we really giving up much, actually? I mean, we already know that smartphones, especially iPhones, are already surveillance and tracking devices, even without using the passport card. I mean, if Apple or any other big tech company can see you moving in an airport and see you at a TSA checkpoint through the GPS features of the phone, do they kind of already know anyway that you're entering, TSA checkpoint, you're going to travel domestically? So are we actually giving up that much more by actually using the passport card through the wallet? These are the questions that are on my mind. I'd love to open up the discussion to see what people think. We got Patrick, we got Jay. Patrick, what do you think? Are we giving up much by if we use a passport card on the Apple Wallet? And if we are giving up much, is it worth it? Is it worth the convenience?
Yeah, I think that is a great question. I think at its core, I think you hit it correctly where it is, where in terms of protection, privacy, data management, every day you are somewhere along this curve of somewhere between convenience and, trackability, for lack of a better word. So Every time you pay with a credit card, that's trackable, it's auditable. When you pay with cash, it's a lot less convenient, but it's not trackable, right? If someone wants to confirm that you actually in fact transacted in that example, they would have to, go subpoena like the CCTV from the convenience store where you got your Red Bull, as opposed to just, looking at your financial transactions. Um, so I think this is a, similar paradigm to use looking at this. Um, and there's a lot more to get into, but just for the beginning of the conversation, I'd say that for most people, I would say that there's not too much of a trade-off. There's a lot of stipulations there that I'll get into later, but I think our phones are so data rich and harvestable, and it already tracks your geographic information. Whether or not that is transmitted to companies, other governments, or authorities, that's another question. So, what more information does a passport have on your phone? I mean, it theoretically would have everything a passport has: uniquely identifiable information, uh, theoretically your, biometrics, the biometric component of a passport. Um, I think that's the key as to why it's for domestic use, is that it may not be able to, or maybe it will be able to RFID that biometric information. Um, and then on top of that, you're basically storing it, and I think this is the key point. You're basically storing it with Apple. You're storing it on a network or a database that is a redundancy. Whether or not that redundancy is worth it to you for convenience, I don't think it's any necessarily added more convenience. Um, but at the flip time, you are essentially duplicating your travel document, your credentials, in an additional spot that is not 150% controlled by you. So I think you know consider, I can use a handful of examples and I'll get into it later, but the idea that there's an antiquated idea that people take their passports, and if they're not traveling, they keep them in a safety deposit box. Well, what if the safety deposit box is not controlled by the bank, but controlled by a government institution? Uh, that changes the risk matrix. It also adds an additional attack vector. So I think for the everyday domestic traveler, who favors convenience over anything else, maybe this is a positive. But for those who like having a little bit more privacy, I don't think the convenience is worth it. I would argue that if you're the type of person who has their entire life on their phone with 30,000 photos backed up to iCloud, has all your payment information on your phone, and feels comfortable leaving your house with just your phone, this is not that much of an added step. But if you're someone who travels, and when they travel carries, an RFID blocking or signal blocking Faraday cage bag for your phone when you go through international transit, which I know sounds crazy, but if you're going through Moscow International Airport, or you might want to, um, uh, then this is probably not for you.
Patrick, is it possible that the worth itness actually depends on whether you're an iPhone user or not, right? Because if you're an iPhone user, you're presenting yourself at the port, the TSA port. Let me phrase it this way, and I don't want to just assume away things without actually carefully considering them and thinking about them. What do we think is given? And of course, this involves some level of speculation. But what info do we think is given by using the passport card in the Apple Wallet to pass through the TSA check that wouldn't be given just by the person carrying an iPhone? Let's say that two people, one has the passport card in the Apple iPhone, they present the passport card electronically, they pass through. The other person uses their physical passport card, but they have an Apple iPhone on them, no Faraday cage, nothing like that. What's the delta in information that we think is being given up? To me, and I mean, I guess I'll just start with answering my own question. What comes to my mind? One is just the fact of actually passing through the TSA. Okay, with like the the fact of passing through TSA with the card, okay, would be stored, right, with Apple, ostensibly on Apple Wallet, right? Whereas in the second, portion, you'd have to kind of presume, right? There's still a presumption, right? That if the GPS shows a person at a TSA checkpoint in a line, and then the GPS shows them on the other side, basically at the gates, you'd have to presume that they eventually pass through TSA. But it's a presumption, right? It's less robust of a set of knowledge than actually the iPhone having the info that the person presented that passport card. That's the first difference that comes to my mind, but I think I'm struggling to think of other differences. What do you think, Patrick?
Well, I hate to use the example at an airport of a black box, but I'm going to do that. Um, the Apple Wallet is a component of iOS. So iOS has access to any information you store on iOS. To give a brief example, if you have a social media account, like say, for example, an X account, it will occasionally say, hey, X has access to all of your photos. Is this cool? And some people limit it to, some people say, yeah, that's fine. Some people are like, no, I don't post photos on X. Completely lock that app's access to my information in this regard. But iOS as its own ecosystem doesn't have necessarily that same controls. It's all part of the same ecosystem. It's not an outside app, right? And so, you know, in the case of having your passport information on your phone for passing through a security threshold, obviously it's going to transmit everything the same as if you were to run your travel document through one of the e-readers, right? So that's generally gives biometric information. And like, what does that mean for most people? It means it provides you with observable metrics. It shows you a photo that can presumably is based on that can be then fed into a system for facial recognition. It gives you your height. It gives your weight. Unfortunately, for most people, it does give you weight. Eye color, hair color, blah blah blah, right? And so the point is that it is this full nexus of information to be able to identify you. So obviously, it's going to pass all of that information along. But will it have anything else that iOS collected that also gets passed along? I don't know. Is there the potential that it does? Yeah, it could. It could pass along. Where were you for the 2 hours preceding TSA checkpoint? This is a hypothetical. I don't know. But for example, where were you for the previous 2 or 3 hours before going to the airport? If it was in some shady industrial park, maybe that throws some information along. If you're at the Mall of America, maybe they're going to flag you at, customs because they're like, or if you're someone like me and you're coming back from Canada with, some ludicrously expensive Cuban cigars, and they're like, oh, this guy was at the cigar lounge. Maybe you should check him to make sure he doesn't have a commercial amount of Cuban cigars. Theoretically, if you have geolocation on your phone, that could theoretically be passed along. And again, this is all speculation. But
Yeah.
also, there's a reason that it's happening in the United States and with an iPhone, because this is the deepest market for iPhones with the largest penetration and broadly the quickest user acceptance, at least in a Western context. And so I think that there's a reason that this is here. Is all this information going to be passed along right away? I doubt it. But, a precedent is being set, and how fast it expands in the future is anyone's question.
So, Jay, sorry, let me just ask this one follow-up question with Patrick. So Patrick, your thought is, I just want to clarify that iOS, if you start using your passport card in the wallet, that iOS might start when you're at the TSA checkpoint, they might start giving additional information about you besides actually the passport card, like that eventually TSA might start extracting from the wallet, app, the fact that you were in the industrial park or the mall, that type of thing. Is that kind of your concern?
I mean, the short answer is in the future, yes. Right now, it's purely a hypothetical. Um, but if I can expand on the example, in a perfect world where data is readily available, your geographic location and how it's tracked on your phone is unique to you, right? And we know that when you go through passport and immigration control, they do have access to your social media accounts, supposedly. And there is this like data trail that gets instantly brought up when you're passing through a security checkpoint. They could theoretically have all that information already and not need your phone to have it sent over when you use a digital ID. But as a check against that, I could see a world where they might want to collect that information from multiple sources, right? Organically harvested data, and then data that is collected by your phone. I don't think this is necessarily the motivation for Apple. I don't think that it is something they necessarily want, but it is a potential that can come of a process like this. And I think trends point to that. Is that 2 years in the future? Is that 20? I don't know. But, I think trends point towards a more data rich and less transparent environment in the future.
Yeah, I don't think whatever information we throw off on social media, I don't think it's going to be as much as what your phone has about you, right? I mean, the speaker phone, the GPS, the movements, all that type of stuff. So I think that's a serious concern. Um, yeah, I mean, if the information's available, eventually there's going to be a demand for it. That's the way I believe. That's kind of the way I look at things. And as far as intentions are concerned, yeah, maybe that's not Apple's intentions, but I mean, who cares what intentions are? What matters is what ends up happening, or where there's eventually the strong incentive, to you know for information to be forwarded on. Yeah. So you know what, I didn't even think about that, and this is why I'm glad I asked the question at the beginning before, kind of presuming there's not much delta in the info that's passed on by presenting the physical card versus presenting the card on the Apple Wallet. And I think you just touched on perhaps the biggest potential attack vector, just the fact that without our knowing additional information, TSA could start extracting or demanding additional information from your phone, along with supposedly the passport card. So, yeah, Jay, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was thinking with Pat's example about going through Moscow's international airport with your phone. I was thinking this passport card application, foreign governments, even if you're a dual or a triple citizen of various countries, if you have all of that information about you on your phone, they can tell that potentially they could tell if certain information were stored, or if your passport card is just on there, they can tell that you're a U.S. citizen. So let's say you use your U.S. passport to exit the U.S., and then you arrive through a third country to Tehran International Airport or in Moscow, right? And they look at your phone, they're like, oh, well, you're a U.S. citizen. That could put you at risk in those countries.
Yeah, I think that that's fair because, well, as it stands now, this digital passport on an iPhone is only for domestic travel in the States. But in your example, I think that's largely true. Because, and to bring it back to like old school passports, when most people travel, they do store their passport in a protective sleeve or an RFID protector, which is in fact a Faraday cage. And it is, founded or not, a means to protect the biometric information on your passport from some form of e-reader or something. Um, and some airports do have, you know, um, those types of e-readers upon entry. So I think that it makes sense that if you were to have effectively a duplicated passport in a digital form on your phone, you would want to treat it with the same treatment that you would a regular passport, particularly one that you're not going to use and you want to keep, on your persons. I think that's a great example. Yeah, if you're going in the Moscow example, um, I have experience at the Moscow airport. Story for another day, but yeah, I mean, if you want to go there with a U.S. passport, you're going to face a completely different immigration procedure as you would if you showed up with an EU passport or with, a non-North American, non-European passport as well. And insofar as countries sharing information with each other, if you go to Europe on an American passport, or you go to Europe and you use a European passport to enter, and then you use your American American credential to re-enter America, after your, week trip to, Berlin or whatnot. Like, the EU and the United States do share information. So they might know, if they really wanted to dig, they might be able to ascertain that you have multiple citizenships, but it requires like them to proactively look, right? Whereas a country like Russia probably is not going to have access, probably doesn't share data with the United States. And so in those scenarios where you might have a citizenship to what they perceive as a hostile country, it does really benefit for you to protect that secondary citizenship and keep it on the DL, so to speak. So I don't know, Parvis, you might have a little bit more deeper knowledge on this, but I think that that's a good like paradigm to consider with this. Would you protect your physical passport in one scenario? If that's true, then you should do it from a digital perspective as well.
Yeah, I mean, the way I look, Patrick, at information sharing is um, not through the lens of do they share info or do they not share info, but more from the lens of how automatic the info sharing is. We've seen examples, and I've read in FOIA archives, perhaps you have as well. Even the United States and the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, sharing information with one another through consular channels and other channels about citizens, about people and things like that. So I look at the info sharing on the spectrum, right? If it's automatic, right, then that information needs to be treated one way. If it requires hoops to be jumped through and for approvals to be gotten and for even just a manual request to be made, well, those are additional levels of friction, which overall reduce the chances that the information becomes shared, right? So, other than that caveat, I think I pretty much agree with the way you characterized the issue. And I mean, part of what we're dealing here with is the fact that we don't, not all information sharing is publicized or even public accessible information. So I don't know what I look at information sharing as kind of the way I look at it is, if we know it's there, then okay, we can be secure in the knowledge that it's there, but we can never be secure in the knowledge of a negative. The fact that we don't know that a particular set of info is being shared between certain jurisdictions is not evidence. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That type of thing. That's the way I look at it. And when there is no evidence of the information sharing happening, right? We still always have to consider the possibility that it's there, but we just don't have knowledge of it happening. So as far as protecting your passport information, right? The easier we make it for your information to be shared at TSA or elsewhere, right? The more reliably it's going to be collected. So from that perspective, I think I'm more of a fan of either not using the passport card on the iPhone wallet, or if possible, right, just using it selectively when you just you understand I'm going to use it this time. I'm making a proactive decision to use it for this trip, and I have decided that I'm totally fine with all information from iOS being forwarded along, if in fact that's what happens. And I still prefer to use it. The problem is, and the reason I say if possible, is that we know in practice, the vast majority of humans, most of us, most of the time, just choose the path of convenience, right? We start off oftentimes by saying, "Oh no, I'm only going to use this in select circumstances." But if the path provides less friction, if it's easier, we tend to just default to using it. And that's what I guess would be the danger in starting to use the passport card in the wallet at all, right? Once you use it once, you see, oh yeah, this is a lot easier. I don't have to putz around with a physical card. Okay, yeah, I'm just going to default to using it all the time, right? So it might be like breaking the seal in that sense, right? If you want to protect your privacy, maybe just to maintain discipline, you don't ever use the passport card, right? Just so you don't slip into the malaise of taking that path for convenience sake.
Yeah, I think there's a great couple examples to compared to kind of look at this, the breaking the seal, so to speak, on like user acceptance. I mean, the perfect example is use of payment information in China, where you don't need a wallet anymore for your ID, for your payment, for anything. Your whole life is your phone. But all of that information is absolutely harvested, down to your socials, down to your payment information, and it's algorithmically fed into, a bunch of intakes, presumably government, for everything from, social credit to, all these other types of uh, KPIs, we'll call them that. But I think, the information sharing aspect is interesting because it's the point where you can get essentially caught up where you're trying to conceal something. And anytime you duplicate a travel credential, or a travel document, I shouldn't call it a credential, but a travel document like passport information, you're essentially creating an additional means for a country to check against. And if you can have them check it against something as data rich as your phone, you're potentially opening yourself up to, you know, making sure that any and all governments know transparently all of the cards you hold in your deck. I have this goofy example. It's very imperfect, but last year there was a guy who essentially faked his own death in Wisconsin. I don't know if you heard this story, Parviz. He faked his own death where he was in a kayak. He overturned his kayak in one of the Great Lakes. I think he was in Wisconsin, and then they started doing a bunch of research, and they found out that he recently reported his passport stolen so that he could get his original passport, his U.S. passport, reissued. And he tried to do that secretly. And there were some other things that, between that passport reissuance and a couple other things, that made them think that this was premeditated. And they ultimately found it. I think he was in Poland, where he ran off to meet someone he met on the internet. Not a wise move as a grown adult, but it goes to show you that essentially, because he recreated his passport, because when you say your passport's lost, they obviously decommission it, right? But there's no physical puncture there's no degradation to the wall, to the passport, because they assume it has been lost and therefore it is not going to be in use. And so when they run the biometrics on it, it gets flagged as a discontinued passport. But then he had a new one issued, and so that that's essentially that same duplication that I'm talking about. So there's other examples I'll bring up later, but I think that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I did. I followed that story as well too, out of just interest aside from the passport issue. I'm looking at this article. I'll post a link to this article, NBC News. It says that he used his own passport in Canada, and that helped authorities trace his long journey overseas. So yeah, as far as when the passport is quote unquote run and the biometrics information is pulled, of course that creates basically a trace, and also can flag, and it also kind of brings up the issue, or kind of the interesting scenario where sometimes border officials, right, especially if it's an overland crossing, don't necessarily scan. They just take a look and wave you through. And granted, that happens, I think, less frequently nowadays, but that practice is still around. In some places, sometimes that still happens. You still get wave throughs, or just present the passport and it doesn't get scanned.
Yeah, and I'm going to bring up also just I'm not a lawyer. I'm a researcher. I do genealogical research. In history, you do find it happens more often than people know. In history, particularly when divorce was very frowned upon, and social kind of social contracts were more community enforced, you do get people who come. I get people come to me, say, "Hey, I have this ancestor. I need to find their death certificate from 1940 whatever, 1920 whatever." and I just can't find it. And the reason they can't find it is because their ancestor just decided one day, I'm going to go jump on the train, pay in cash, change my name, and live a new life somewhere. And that was very easy to do in the 1920s. There's no social security numbers. You wanted to change your name. What ID was there that you needed to change? Nobody had driver's license back then, you know? So it was very easy to just run away from your life and start anew. And, comparing that to this example of this guy who tried to fake his death last year, it shows you how difficult that is to do today on just such a grand global scale, because your identity is duplicated from an ID perspective in so many locations, state, federal, and internationally, and with foreign governments, that you really have to have just this incredible level of foresight to do anything nefarious. And in this case, we're not even talking about anything like that. It's just the data that's harvested on your phone being, tied at the hip to your travel document. So uh, I think that there are cases between 100 years ago, 50 years ago, even 30 years ago to today that show you how difficult it is um, to get around anything in this data rich environment. And that's part of the reason why I think more people are looking for multiple citizenships, multiple residencies, because they want to follow the law. They want to give up the least amount of information but follow the law to afford them the biggest opportunities for mobility. And I think this example here with the digital ID is a perfect example of that convenience versus access, that I think a lot of people, as they are consumers of these tools, will ultimately have to deal with.
Yeah, great points. So if we were to rank the ways of presenting travel documents, from the one that's, let's say, most private on one side and least private on the other side, it seems, right, like I would, if anybody disagrees, but it seems like the more low tech you go, the more chance you have of preserving privacy. I mean, that's kind of the way I see things. But of course, please let me know if anybody disagrees. So if on one hand you have, let's say, just an extreme, not having to present any documents, let's call that condition 0. Condition 1, presenting a physical document to a border official, but it's not scanned. Condition 3, presenting a physical document to a border official, or let's say TSA, and having it scanned. And then let's say there's the next condition. So what would that be? Condition 3, yeah, 0, 1, 2, 3. And then let's say 3, which is really the fourth level, right? Which would be presenting a travel document that's linked with some sort of electronic device. In this case, of course, it's iOS and Apple Wallet, right? And that obviously gets scanned. It has to be scanned, right? Because it's presented on a phone. And it presents the attack vector of additional information, private information of the person that's collected by iOS being forwarded along with the passport, right? That's kind of how I see so far this shaping up, as far as if you look at the privacy spectrum and presenting documents. And in immigration law, I guess I'll just say I'll say this one little kind of this, it's not a story, but I guess this little corner of immigration law. And any American immigration lawyers listening to this probably know what I'm talking about. There's something called a Quilantan entry in U.S. immigration law, and that basically refers to a situation in which a person presented themselves at the U.S. border, but they were just waved through. It's also called a wave through. Okay, they were waved through without having their travel documents checked. Okay, and then they enter. The reason it matters is because technically under immigration law, that's not considered an entry without inspection. The person presented themselves to a border official, a CBP, or I guess at that time it would be INS official, and they were just waved through. Okay, it's not an entry without inspection. It presents unique problems, right? Because the person doesn't have proof of the entry with inspection. So years later, when the person's trying to what we call adjust status, which means apply for a green card from within the United States, one of the requirements of being able to adjust status is you have to have entered with inspection. Okay, right? If you have to have an entry with inspection, or a waiver to that requirement. And so we have these things called equivalent entry. This type of scenario, at least for entries into the United States, less common, much less common now than they were before, but they still exist around the world. They're still around, right? People basically just presenting themselves, being waved through without even having to present a document, or sometimes, like I said, that what I would consider condition one, which is presenting the document to the official, but the official actually doesn't scan anything. So from this perspective, right? If you look at if you're using a U.S. passport card for domestic travel at a TSA checkpoint on your Apple iPhone wallet, you're going all the way towards the spectrum of possibly max convenience, but definitely less, least privacy, and also exposure to that additional attack vector that Patrick mentioned at the beginning of the space, which is the possibility that iOS starts forwarding on information about, where were you, where did GPS show you were 2 hours before presenting yourself at that TSA. So I think this is how I'm shaping up looking at the issue of privacy practices vis-a-vis how you present your travel document, either at a domestic checkpoint or an international checkpoint.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. And the best way to kind of flesh these concepts out is to, at least for me, is to look at comparative examples. And I think the one that comes to mind that I'm going to bring up, and then I'm going to shoot it down myself, is essentially global entry. So global entry, for those of you who don't know, is a quote unquote real ID in the United States. People don't know that. Many people don't. But if you're ever coming back from an international trip and re-entering the United States, you use your global entry. You don't use the card. You use your face. And it takes a photo of your face. Presumably it deletes it after that's what they say. Whether it does or not, I don't know. But that's flushed up against, some type of database to ensure that you are who you say you are, right? I am an identical twin, so my face is not necessarily hyper unique, but the interesting thing about it is that your facial likeness, like just a facial analysis, or similar to gait analysis, doesn't have trailing information. It is point in time information. Are you who you say you are? Essentially, it's a computer verifying your likeness with observable characteristics. There are a few scenarios where you can modify your face. And so when you compare that to something like a digital ID on your phone that collects a bunch of information for you, you suddenly expand that time horizon. It's not point in time analysis. It's information that's collected over a larger period of time. And so even though it may not seem as intrusive as, say, facial recognition, it is intrusive over the concept of time, because you're essentially being able, your iOS has access to all that information. Again, whether it dispenses it now, probably not. But would it potentially dispense it in the future? Possibly. And would it be new information? Not even that. It might just be used to verify already held information or already farmed information. So, I think that is the piece to consider, is how much your phone, like collectible information versus point in time information.
Yeah, great point. We have to think about the info that we're giving off on a timeline, right? Because we're all hopefully going to live long, happy, productive lives. And especially with information synthesizing tools becoming available like AI, it's so much easier and cheaper to just obtain a big dump of information about a person and then have AI sorted out into trends and patterns and information that can be acted upon, whether for good purposes or for nefarious purposes. Now, one thing I wanted to just go over, right, is the TSA website, the list of acceptable ID, right? Because if you're listening to this, or if you're thinking about whether or to what extent you want to use your iPhone wallet to use your U.S. passport card, right? To make that decision, it would be helpful to know what are the alternatives? What else can you use? And I'm looking at this page. It's called Acceptable Identification at the TSA Checkpoint. I've linked to this underneath this spaces, if in case anybody wants to pull this up. And at the top, there's a list of real ID compliant IDs, right? So first is real ID compliant driver's license, U.S. passport card, U.S. passport, permanent resident card, right? So that's a green card. And I won't list every one of these bullet points, but there's about 12, I think it looks like 12 to 14 different bullet points, right? And then there's a heading underneath that says expired ID. And here's another thing that I find most people don't know, right? TSA currently accepts expired ID up to 2 years after expiration for the above listed forms of identification. And that's interesting. I'm just now reading that it says 2 years. This must have changed recently, okay, because for a long time it was 1 year. Okay, in fact, I think the last time I consulted this page, it was 1 year. You could use acceptable ID that was expired for up to 1 year. In practice, I've done this many, many times, right? I typically don't waste an opportunity to pass through TSA without experimenting with something or checking something. I typically don't ever pass through TSA with just a regular, real ID compliant ID that's valid. And so I've done this many times. So 2 years, right? Up to 2 years for expired ID. Then there's this other heading that says don't have acceptable ID. And this is the thing that really, really very few people know about in my experience. Definitely very few clients that I speak to or people that I talk to on online. The TSA officer, I'm just going to read from this. The TSA officer may ask you to complete an identity verification process, which includes collecting information such as your name and current address to confirm your identity. If your identity is confirmed, you will be allowed to enter the screening checkpoint where you may be subject to additional screening. You will not be allowed to enter the security checkpoint if you choose to not provide acceptable identification, you decline to cooperate with the identity verification process, or your identity cannot be confirmed. So what is this saying? This is saying you can try to still pass through TSA without having the acceptable ID, but you have to go through an alternative process. You have to be fully cooperative. And of course, there's no guarantee that your identity is going to be proven by the process. I find this really interesting, and I'm going to be testing this process out this year. At least once with the Palau digital residency ID. I'm going to use that as one of my experiments for my series on what the Palau digital residency ID can be used for. And I might even try this later this year, presenting myself at the TSA checkpoint with no ID. Okay, so those are two things that I'm two experiments I'm going to use. But the bottom line is, vis-a-vis the U.S. passport card in the wallet, the point is, it's not like if you don't have a valid real ID compliant ID, you have no chance of passing through TSA. You still have a chance. It's just that it might not be a reliable chance. And if you're flying, for example, cross country for work engagement or something that's really important, right? It might not be acceptable. It might not be an acceptable risk for you to present yourself at TSA with a non-real ID compliant ID and risk not being able to pass through. But there's a chance. And then if anybody else out there has an experience with presenting yourselves with unacceptable ID to TSA or no ID, I would love to hear about it. Feel free to step up and let us know.
So I do, not for myself, but my family members, some of them are very forgetful, particularly my dad and my brother. And my dad actually presented himself at a TSA checkpoint with no identification at all. He forgot his ID at home. I think he forgot his wallet or something like that. And he presented himself with no ID, and they were able to let him through the checkpoint eventually after asking him some questions about himself. I think maybe like when and where he was born, stuff like that to verify his identity. But they were able to let him pass. He has recently entered with expired IDs and temporary paper IDs. My brother as well. He entered TSA checkpoint. He went through it with no ID, I think twice, and it took a little bit longer, but he was able to get through, and he said it was not really an issue.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. We know people get through, right? It does work sometimes. I think the question is like how reliably, right? For every 100 people that are a US citizen that present themselves with no ID, what percentage are going to be able to get through and get to their flight, right? I think that's kind of the $1 million question. We need more data. We need more experiments for that. I'd love it if other people, have the will to test such things. But yeah, that's good data. Thank you, Jay.
Yeah, I would speculate that, like, when people present themselves at a TSA checkpoint with no ID, I think part of whether they get through or not might have to do with how much info does TSA have about them? Like, have they flown before? Has their ID been logged into the system? Because if it has, then they can probably answer questions about who they are. But if it's person maybe who's from a rural area who's never flown before ever in their lives, then it might be more difficult.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, if you've been living off grid, born to the Amish, right, and you flying for the first time at 19 or 20 years old, yeah, that's I think it's fair to assume that person's going to have a harder time proving their identity with TSA. The other thing to consider is when you're presenting yourself to TSA with an unacceptable form of ID, you're at their mercy for a discretionary process. So they're going to ask you a lot of questions, and some of those are going to be, possibly intrusive questions, and that's an attack on your privacy, right? So, whatever you might be, gaining by not presenting ID as far as privacy, you might be giving right back plus more in answering questions to verify your ID with TSA.
I want to correct myself really fast. Technically, global entry is not a real ID. It is acceptable at TSA as an ID, but it is not quote unquote real ID compliant.
All right. Thank you, Patrick. We have Annalisa Fernandez here, Tech, Culture, and Language in UX. No pressure, Annalisa, but if you want to speak, you're welcome to. So here's the question. Feel free. Anybody can feel free to answer if they want. This is dynamic, right? The program hasn't been rolled out yet. We don't know exactly what this is going to look like. But here's my question, Jay and Patrick, Annalisa, if you want to answer. Do you think you'll end up using the US passport card on iPhone, or let's say if you're not an iPhone user, if you're an Android user, on Android within the next 2 years? Do you think by June 16th, 2027, you will have used the electronic passport option at least one time? And feel free, if anybody says, sorry, ain't gonna answer, it's too much info, I totally respect that. And I might even congratulate you.
I am going to say I'm not going to use that feature, only because it comes down to the idea of being able to say whether or not you quote unquote broke the seal. I think I'm so used to using a passport and a passport card in its current form that the user experience of having supposed additional convenience is not really worth it to me. And frankly, I think that using those IDs is so infrequent in daily life and is more of a travel experience that it really is not the same as the added convenience of, say, using payment information on your phone. I think it's a level of convenience for such a comparatively less frequent process that I don't think it merits it. And I'm just gonna be an old man and stick with my habits.
I would say I think I probably will, because at domestic TSA checkpoints, and I'm not checking into an international flight, my sort of, over the years, what I've been doing is getting to the checkpoints and presenting the ID that I find most convenient to myself at the moment. And that's normally, at this point, it's my driver's license. But I'm always on my phone anyway because I'm kind of addicted to it. So I think that is probably going to be a little bit more convenient for me. So I'll probably install that app and use it. But if I do, there are a couple of scenarios that I'm looking at where I think I would probably stop using it at a certain point. If I'm able to become a dual citizen, I'm thinking I'm kind of working on a citizenship by descent at the moment, so I think at a certain point, giving up that information, if I'm traveling worldwide, might be risky or detrimental. But at the moment, I don't think that there's that much of a drawback to me personally.
Cool. From what I know now, as far as I know, I'm not going to use it. I'm not going to use the feature. The perceived data inconvenience to me is not worth the potential attack vector. I don't trust government. I don't trust big tech. And this attack vector involves both of them. So it's a no for me for now.
Hi, I just wanted to jump in. I'm an Android user, so I've had this on my phone for I think about a year now. So nothing new in the Android world, but I did try to use it at JFK last month and they said, no, we don't do that. And I didn't want to press it. So I left it at that. From a privacy perspective, I understand everybody's concerns. But I guess how I feel is that, you know, I've traveled through Dubai. They've scanned my iris. So it's a kind of privacy game over for me.
Thanks for that, Annalisa. Were you able to use the passport electronic or the passport card on Android in many other places before the failed attempt at JFK?
I hadn't tried it before that. No, I'll give it a try next week. I'm traveling again, so I'll try again.
Yeah, I'll jump in here real fast, kind of as a joke, but as someone who's done the FBI background check, my fingerprints are out there, and if it's of any novel information, as I am an identical twin, my DNA is the same as someone else in this world. For most iris scans, my eye is like 97% similar. So for most iris scans, it's considered identical. But fingerprints are not; they're environmental. So because mine are out there from the FBI background check, again, a little bit game over.
Okay. Well, it's 11:56. We've been going for about 53 minutes or so. Any other thoughts or questions? Should we maybe end this one early? Or is there any other interesting aspects related to this that we want to talk about?
I have one. I'll bring it up as kind of a closing thought process. So, for those who don't know, the Palau ID, which is a sovereign-backed physical ID card issued by the country of Palau, also comes with a digital ID, and that digital ID is yours. It is meant to be stored on a blockchain. So once you log into Palau's system, you essentially take control of that digital card, and you can put it on an exchange wallet or like a hot wallet or a cold wallet. And I realize this is getting into the kind of the blockchain side of things, but that is an example of a digital ID in which no database has control over it. It is effectively your ID, but how you take custody of that digital ID is up to you. You can store it on a hot wallet, which means it's online, or you can store it on a cold wallet, which means it's on essentially the same as like an external hard drive, right? So when you compare something like that to a digital ID held on your phone, it's very similar in that it is a digital copy of what is already an existing ID. But when you're hosting it on an iOS or iOS is an operating system, but behind that operating system is a black box of database information on you and potentially system-wide information that you don't know about. That's where the control aspect of information attached to that ID is an unknown. So I think my final thought or comparison is to compare not only a digital ID to a physical one, but a digital ID in a system you don't have complete control over versus one in which you do.
That's a great point. And I have not explored the digital side of the Palau residence ID, nearly to the extent that I've been exploring use of the physical card and electronic copies of the physical card. So that's something I'm glad you brought that up. You kind of nudged me there, Patrick. That's one aspect of the Palau digital residency that I'm going to start getting into a little bit. I'm going to have some experiments, some field reports related to that as well. All right, cool. So we're pretty much at an hour now. If nobody has anything else they'd like to add, I think that'll wrap up the conversation. Thank you, everybody who showed up, everybody who participated. Patrick, Annalise, Jay, Chris is here, and then we always have anonymous listeners as well. This is our 8th mobility space. We're going to do 50 this year. These are spaces related to freedom of movement, mobility, dual citizenship. We're doing them every Monday and every Thursday. So we're going to have another one this Thursday. I'm pretty sure that the topic is going to be on what I call the detained man's switch. It's the cousin of the dead man's switch. But I typically put up a poll with the options for the next space topic, and I let people vote on it. And 9 times out of 10, I go forward with whatever topic wins. So that's it. If anybody has any interest in one topic over another, feel free to comment or DM me. And of course, I'll take that into consideration. Otherwise, thanks a lot for joining, and hope you come Thursday or for other spaces this year. Take care.